Hi, everyone. As people continue to join us, I just ask if for the intro, for the first few minutes here, if you can keep your mics on mute. You can turn your cameras on if they aren't. If you prefer to leave them off, you can, but we prefer having them on just so we can see your faces. But yeah, please keep your mics on mute for right now. I'll let you know when you can turn those on. Hey, Philippe. We're going to go ahead and get started. I know we'll have people probably popping in throughout the course of the hour too. First off, thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Lauren Balbrin. I am the career advisor at DePaul for our technology and design career community. Jameson Dixon, who is also here, I know his internet was having a few difficulties. Hopefully he'll be rejoining us in a few moments, is also on our tech and design career community on our employer engagement side. We are starting this Tech Talk series. I know during this really crazy and surreal time here where everybody is remote, we wanted to still find ways to connect with students and connect you with employers that hopefully can provide you with some sage wisdom about current trends in the marketplace, where things might be headed. Our first Tech Talk event today, we're doing an interview with Basecamp. Basecamp is a Chicago-based distributed workforce. They make the Basecamp project management software. We are delighted to be graced with the presence of Andrea Leroux, their director of HR, and Justin White, one of their programmers. We'll start by, I'll be asking a few prepared questions, but we hope that some of you have brought questions of your own to ask as well. We'll be turning it over to you soon, should you have questions to ask. But first, I guess I just wanted to start by introducing both Andrea and Justin. And if you can maybe each of us take you through your roles at Basecamp, telling us a little bit about what you do.
Sure.
Andrea, if you want to go first.
Yeah. Hey, everybody. I'm Andrea. I have worked at Basecamp for just over 9 years. I am the head of HR. We call it people operations at Basecamp because I'm not only responsible for kind of the policy and procedure and compliance aspect of things, but also making sure that our employees have an excellent experience working at Basecamp and making sure the culture stays where we want it. So at Basecamp, that's human resources, that's recruiting and hiring and onboarding new employees, it's benefits and perks administration, and employee relations. I'm in Chicago, but we, of course, have a fully distributed remote team. Justin?
I'm Justin White. I've been at Basecamp for a little over 3 years. I was also a DePaul graduate in 2015. I work as a programmer here on our security and infrastructure and performance team. And I'm also based in Chicago, even though, like Andrea said, we're spread across the US. We have about 10 to 15 people out of maybe 50 some that live in the Chicago area. The rest are spread across the US. And I think we have people in Asia, Europe, and do we still have people in South America now? Or
no,
no, we no longer do. She moved here.
She did.
So
that's great. And if you could maybe, Andrea, maybe ask if you can maybe take us through a brief history of Basecamp and a little bit more about what Basecamp does and its software that it creates.
Yeah, Basecamp's been around about 20 years. It started as a design shop, and Jason Fried, one of the founders, was a web designer, and he, in the course of doing business, realized that they needed software or some sort of platform, some sort of tool to manage the client work that they were doing. So from that came Basecamp, the idea for Basecamp, and the design for Basecamp. Shortly after that, David Hennemeyer Hansen joined the team. He was a programmer that, a very young programmer at the time that Jason connected with, and David wrote Ruby on Rails, which is the programming language that Basecamp is written in, and how our platform works. So it was the first Rails app. We have grown a lot since the early 2000s, but not too much. We have 56 employees total. that's across 9 countries, mostly in the US. We have worked remotely since day one. David was recruited when he was still living in Copenhagen, and they built Basecamp that way. So we structure our work, or we structure our company and the way that we work around being a remote company. We rely heavily on asynchronous communication, meaning that we're not demanding of people's times when we need it. We have conversations across time zones. We have conversations that you know, if we comment on something, we're not expecting an immediate response. We take our time in our communications. We take care, and all of that contributes to the product that we make. We do everything for Basecamp in-house. We develop Basecamp, we maintain Basecamp, we support it all within the company, all within those 56 people. So that's programming and design, of course, for the application. That's technical operations to support the infrastructure of Basecamp. That's QA, that's customer support. It's administration, like what I do, and it's like media and marketing, kind of more outreachy type things too. We don't outsource much of anything at all. And we've maintained a pretty small, lean team while growing the company, growing the product, and growing the audience and the base over 20 years.
Thank you. So, you know, one of the reasons that we really wanted to talk to a company like yourself first is, you know, with the elephant in the room, the COVID-19 crisis, and everybody being really forced to work remotely. Many folks are really new to remote work culture, what working on a distributed team means, protocols for that. You know, can you talk a little bit more about the decision behind why Basecamp initially wanted to go with the distributed or remote workforce?
Yeah, it really came down to finding the best people to work at Basecamp and not limiting ourselves to a geographic area. Like I mentioned earlier, David was a 19-year-old programmer in Copenhagen, and Jason really liked the work he was doing and wanted to work with him and do something special, and that's where Basecamp came from. So that's kind of the attitude we take when we recruit and hire now, is diversity of background and location, and all of that kind of plays into bringing new things to the product and the company.
Great. We know for many of our students, some of whom maybe haven't worked in field yet, maybe some grad students that have worked in the field or come back to school to get their degree, maybe have some prior experience, some which may have some experience working remotely, some who don't. Could you maybe talk a little bit about some common, you know, pitfalls that maybe new employees sometimes fall into, or maybe, you know, some misconceptions that folks have about starting a remote job?
Yeah, I think one of the things I commonly get asked is like, isn't it very isolating working from home and working remote? And in my experience, that hasn't been the case. I think it probably depends on company culture a bit, but there's a lot of ways, especially today with the internet and world so connected, to stay social with your coworkers and kind of have like water cooler talk that you would have in a traditional office setting. At Basecamp, we have a bunch of different chat rooms. So if you use Basecamp, you know about our campfire chats, or maybe you're familiar with like Slack or something, where you have all these topics, and we'll have different rooms for different like social things. Like we have an all pets room where we talk about pets, or all sports where people are talking about sports, or we have a Chicago office chat where just the people in Chicago are kind of talking about Chicago events. And so I still feel very connected despite actually not being with my coworkers for most of the year. We kind of do different things like that to supplement that social interaction and to get past the sense of like isolation a bit.
Something else I know people struggle with at Basecamp and elsewhere, other remote companies, is maintaining some semblance of structure. If you're commuting to an office, you have a schedule, you have a routine. You get up, you get ready to go, you drive there, and then when you drive home, you're not at work anymore. If you're working at home, you know, your home office or your kitchen table or wherever you're at is your office. And so it kind of can become foggy and hard to separate home life from work life. So we talk a lot about work-life balance, and we talk a lot about shutting down your computer at the end of the day and walking away from work and not checking your email after dinner, or really just creating as firm of a line as you can, whatever that means for you, between home and work. For a lot of people, that means having a dedicated office in their home, and when they're in the office, they're working, and when they're not, they're not. Sometimes that means like something as silly as commuting to work. So like you go and you walk around the block when you're ready to start work, and then you work, and then you commute home at the end of the day. It's just creating whatever works for you as an individual to maintain some boundaries.
Justin, anything you want to add to that? Any tips or tricks to maintaining those boundaries between work life and home life?
Yeah, just I would kind of echo what Andrea said with creating a structure and doing your best to kind of separate yourself from work and home, because it can be very easy to fall into that trap of like, I'm always connected, I'm always at home in my office. And even if you don't have your own home office and you're working from home, having like a designated spot at your kitchen table that you always sit at this spot, and that's where you do your work, and you kind of don't bring it to like your bedroom or somewhere else. Another thing that I do is I often leave my home, even though I'm working from home. I'll usually spend about half my day, the morning, at home, and then the second half of the day, I'll try to go to a coffee shop to kind of break up the routine and remove myself from home, so I'm not going stir crazy, stuck inside all the time. Especially with COVID going on, and we're in this like shelter in place. It's a bit different right now working from home because we are isolated at home. And I've started to notice that, even though I've been working remote for the last 3 years plus, it's been a lot harder just being stuck inside all the time. And in my experience, working from home isn't normally like that. You have the freedom to go work at a coffee shop or out of a park, or, leave and go break up your day somehow.
Yeah, unfortunately, coffee shops, much to my own chagrin, are not an option right now. I know DePaul in itself, our team, we're new to working remotely as well. So it has been, a bit of a learning curve, and a bit of a, us looking for tips and tricks ourselves in order to, keep that balance between work life and home life. Do you ever find, and maybe this is hard to answer if you've been working with Basecamp for a while, like, do you find that are you working more than you think you would be if you were going into an office, or do you find is it easier to keep that delineation between work and home?
I think it's helpful to keep track. I've been asking people to keep track of how much they're actually working. When you don't have those defined start and end points, like for me, usually my defined start and end points of a workday is like taking my kids to school and then picking them up at school. I don't have that anymore. They're over there. So like you have to be mindful of the time that you're actually spending at work, and for like whether that takes the form of underwork or overwork. I think what I just keep asking people to do is keep a log. Like if you hit the time that you want to be working in a day, like you're done for the day, you have to stop. That we don't want people burning out because they can't leave their house. Like that's still something you have to be considerate of. And same goes with underworking. If you're distracted, that's fine. We've been very, very sensitive and giving people a lot of grace about the environment right now at Basecamp. But it's just good information to have personally. Not that Basecamp, the company, is tracking any of that, but it's just good to know and good to track where you're at on like a 40-hour work week.
For me,
Go ahead.
I kind of set a hard start at 9 a.m. It's hard end at 5 p.m. and try to kind of abide by that. But distractions do come up during the day. And so you kind of have to give yourself some grace and wiggle room, and know that like maybe I'll take an extra hour out of the day and, tack that on at the end of it or something like that.
Well, because if you're in an office, you're not sitting at a desk for 8 hours straight. You're like going to get a cup of coffee, you're talking with your coworkers, you're goofing around on the computer. Like no one works a solid 8-hour day, whether they're at home or they're in an office. So it's just trying to replicate as best you can and give yourself a little bit of compassion as best you can in this very weird situation while still getting your work done.
Yeah, and I guess that brings me to that, elephant, the COVID-19 thing. One of the reasons again we want to talk to a company like yourselves first was maybe you've been less affected by everything that's going on, because you've been working remotely for years. But I'm sure everybody's been feeling this in some way or another. So I mean, have your roles changed in the last month and a half with everything that's going on? Has the business model changed, without diving into too many specifics if you don't want to? But can you tell me a little bit about if there has been change for positive or negative in your organization and in your particular roles, how that has altered it?
For sure. Yeah. Logistically, nothing has changed, right? For us, we've always worked remotely. Nothing about how we've worked has changed in the last 6 weeks. People's situations and circumstances have changed dramatically. A lot of people at Basecamp have kids who are now work at home with them. A lot of people, their spouses or your partners are working from home as well with you. You're working in households that aren't designed for more than one person should be working at home at any given time. Certainly not designed for working and providing childcare. So, and on top of that, everyone's dealing with this really uncertain, really just weird situation. And there's a lot of anxiety around that and fear. And people are distracted, rightfully so. So all of that combined means there's less work getting done, which we realized early on was going to be the case, and kind of put the message out to employees that that's okay. Like, you're not robots. You're not cogs in this Basecamp machine. We know that you're human, and we expect you to not get as much done over the next couple of months. And that's okay. So we talked about it. We realize it. Teams are, and it's kind of funny, like teams, and Justin, you can probably talk about SIP, how you guys are just organically kind of finding the balance right now, with modified schedules, with a little bit of grace and compassion for reduced productivity, but still maintaining expectations and setting those expectations ahead of time for the amount of work that's possible to get done right now, and then sticking to those. So maybe those expectations would have been a little bit higher 2 months ago, but we've adjusted, and we're adapting. So remote work-wise, no, nothing's changed. A lot of people's, everyone's still working from home. Everyone's still doing the same jobs. But what we're expecting of people has changed a little bit. As far as my particular role goes, the biggest thing that I've noticed that's changed recently is that we hired someone, she started 2 weeks ago, I think, a week or two ago. And doing the onboarding process remotely is new for us. We've always hired remotely, but we usually bring people to Chicago, to the headquarters office, and their whole team. We bring the whole team that they're being hired into to Chicago to onboard and train in person. It's just we've found that it's easier to get people started on the right foot, get that, like, those relationships forming better and sooner, on an in-person basis, than remotely. So we've adjusted for that a little bit. It's we've just tried to be very intentional about why we do in-person onboarding usually, which is to solidify those team relationships off the bat, and replicate that as best we can in a remote setting by being intentional with the amount of time that people spend together as a team and what they're doing in that time as a team. It's not just project work. It's more foundational, more personal.
Justin, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think Andrea summed it up pretty well. I work on a programming team, or one of our programming teams here, focusing on security and infrastructure and performance. Our day-to-day hasn't really changed too much. My team is already pretty distributed. I work with someone in California, Philadelphia, and then 2 people in Spain. So we're kind of already spanning time zones and all that, and don't have perfect overlap with each other. So our workload has kind of stayed about the same. I think there's a bit of an understanding, like Andrea said, that like people aren't going to be as focused right now and aren't going to be getting as much done. but I think we've still kind of aimed our cycle. We do work in 6-week cycles. We've kind of planned our cycles with the intention of getting roughly the same amount done right now. Just there is more of an understanding that like stuff might slip through right now, and you are probably going to be more distracted, and especially for the people with families that are working from home now, like their spouses or their kids are doing homeschooling. Especially for them, I think it's a bit harder right now and not as normal of a setting. But for me personally, I haven't had a huge change in my day-to-day work from this, thankfully.
That is a good thing. I do want to turn it over to student questions in a few minutes, but I did want to ask one question. Andrea, I know you mentioned this was the first time actually onboarding someone remotely, but you have been hiring remotely for years or interviewing remotely for a while. Some of our students might be new to a remote interview, video interviews, or even pre-recorded video interviews. Can you maybe take us through that? Like what do you typically look for, or maybe some common pitfalls that folks fall into in remote interview settings?
The first thing that comes to mind, and it's the simplest, silliest thing to say, but like make sure your internet connection is working and that your microphone is working. Like whenever you start an interview flustered because of technical difficulties, that just like, it seems to make it really hard to recover from both an interviewer's perspective and definitely the interviewee. The way that we structure interviews at Basecamp is I don't know if it's unique, but we involve a lot of people in a hiring process. I'm always the first person to talk to somebody face to face. We, of course, we do screening of applications and things, and some code review when we hire a programmer. But face to face, people ops is the first face they see. The reason we do that is because we get a really good sense of a person's technical expertise, their background, their writing skills. All of that stuff comes through pretty strongly in a solid application. I talk to them first because we want to get a good sense of what their approach is to work. A broad strokes. What's your approach to work? What do you find important about work? What do you value about work? Less like, walk me through the code you wrote yesterday. More, when you find something to be successful, if you finish a project and it's successful, why do you feel that way? And walk me through that project and walk me through your thought process. So just in general, applying remotely is not any different. Like, I don't think that there's a fundamental difference in interviewing remotely than there is to interviewing in person. Interviewing in general, I think good advice for anybody is to be really thoughtful about the job you're applying for, how your background translates to that role, why you're applying for that role in the first place. We look for people who are applying to Basecamp for this job. It's not people that kind of blast out applications. And so, yeah, remotely beyond technical stuff, just, I think, be as prepared as you would in any other interview. Be prepared to talk about everything you would in a regular interview. Be prepared for a panel interview. We usually have 2 or 3 people on a call at any given time, which can be intimidating or surprising, but we like to get as much input on a candidate as we can from different perspectives.
Yeah. I don't know if you can talk at all about how the technical portion of the interview works remotely.
We don't do like whiteboarding at all. For a programmer role, we ask them to submit code that they've written, either code that they've written before, like if they have open source stuff on GitHub, we'll ask for that, like something that something that they can talk about and walk through, and something that's exciting to them. We can walk through in one of the more technical interviews after mine. Sometimes we ask people to write new code, where one of the programmers on the hiring team will come up with a problem, and we'll ask our final 20 or so to to do the code exercise, is what we call it. And then they submit it in a 3 or 4 day time period, I think we usually give. And our programmers on the hiring team review it for clean code, hygiene, first of all, kind of like a simplicity or an elegance that we look for in our code, and some intention. Like, why did you do, like, people will put a README or something along with it. It'll be like, why did you make these choices that you made? So we consider not just if the code works, but the thought that went into it.
Cool. Justin, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that. I don't know
Yeah,
if you get involved in the hiring process at all, or.
Yeah, Justin was super helpful when we hired his teammate.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've helped with a few of them. I would say one of the biggest things I would encourage anyone when applying for any job remote, and specifically with our company anyways, but I think it applies for anyone, is your written communication, because I think so much of it is focused on how you're able to communicate and articulate and write. And for Basecamp, we do a lot of asynchronous communication, which is in the form of writing. So your writing skills, I think, really shine and weigh heavily on our application process, regardless of what role you're in, whether it's programming, designer, anything. So I know DePaul loves writing and communication, and so I felt like personally I learned a lot from DePaul that helped me with that in regards to working remote. For the technical side, like Andrea said, we usually have you kind of just talk through some code that you have written before. I don't really know how this works outside of it, because I've only been involved in the technical hiring, really. But my biggest piece of advice is kind of just to make a portfolio of your own projects, and they don't need to be anything serious. They can be something that you've made in a day even, and just have a few examples of some like real code that you're proud of, that a real project you've made, or if you're a designer, just, you know, some mock-ups of websites that you can talk about and show real work that you've done. I think that's a huge help. And when I'm looking at applicants, I always love seeing like a project portfolio that they've put together. And if you ask them about sharing a project that they've worked on, you know, someone who's like eager to talk about one of their projects, and it doesn't need to be anything serious. Like I made a simple weather application that just kind of like told you the temperature, nothing fancy, nothing new, but like just being able to talk about that and the code behind it, I think is like a very valuable thing to do.
And do you think even if a student only had school projects to show, do you think that's okay?
Yeah, totally. I definitely put school projects in my project portfolio. I mean, I personally spent a lot of time on school projects before graduating, and some of them were like, you know, my senior capstone projects that I had spent the entire quarter or even 2 quarters working on. And so definitely show those and talk about those and be proud of those. And you put a lot of work into those, I hope. And yeah, share it, definitely. Put it in your portfolio.
Great, thank you. I did want to open it up to any student questions. If you do have a question, you can go ahead and unmute your microphone to ask. If you feel more comfortable, you can also type your question into the chat as well. So any questions from our students? Don't everyone ask at once now. Okay, well, if I have a few more questions I can ask, but as we go here, Jameson, did you want to?
Yeah, I did have a quick question. Justin, we chatted yesterday, last time we connected, about just when you decided to go to Basecamp, you were really particular about, you knew you wanted a remote work culture. You wanted to work remotely. I'm curious, just what led you to that decision to, like, you kind of knew before graduation you wanted to go into remote work. I'm curious, what was your process to decide? What kind of led to that decision for you?
Yeah. I think my first kind of experience with remote work, I guess, was through DePaul. I took a class that was mostly remote based. And so I kind of first got into it through that and realized I really liked learning on my own at home and kind of getting to do stuff at my own pace. And being in an environment that worked for me instead of like a classroom or an office if you're in a professional environment. I also really was attracted to the flexibility of being able to work wherever I wanted, whether that was at my home or a coffee shop or even in a different state or different country. Um, just being able to kind of have that freedom and flexibility was something I was pretty keen on. And so I started my job search after DePaul basically only looking at remote companies. And there's a lot of good resources out there to find jobs that are remote. And even before this pandemic, I think there's a lot of really good remote jobs right now. We used to run a job board called weworkremotely.com, and I know that's still active right now and has a lot of job listings on it, so you can check that out if you're interested. But yeah, I just like the freedom of being able to work wherever I wanted, wherever worked best for me. And not only just location, but I think a lot of remote companies do work kind of asynchronously. And so you're not expected to be there from 9 to 5, even though I happen to set my own schedule from 9 to 5. It just works for me. It's nice to be able to take time in the middle of the day if you need to go do something and then come back later and finish it. And you just get more flexibility, I think, than I would in a traditional office setting. And I think with the pandemic, we're going to see a lot more companies realizing that they can run their business remote. And I think we'll see even more jobs start to transition to remote work or allowing people to work remote anyways.
That's interesting. It's interesting. One of the, as we're talking to students, one of the challenges students so far I've heard is some students feel like when they get up, and students that are on the line, feel free to kind of jump in, kind of as DePaul has transitioned to online classes. Some students have expressed to me that they get up in the morning and they feel like they step into the computer, like literally step into the computer and step into classes. And so I'm curious, not just when you're working from home, what was some of like just, and I asked you just because I know that you particularly were looking for remote work. What was some of like that, like as a student, did you have any challenges? Were there challenges kind of transitioning to like before the pandemic, just kind of starting out? Did you have any kind of challenges or barriers to just, were you figuring out schedule or getting into your groove, or just coming from that transition from DePaul to now I'm a full-time remote work employee? What was that transition like?
Yeah, it's definitely was not all seamless, and it's taken, time to refine it. There's definitely that feeling of like, I just woke up and I'm in the office. And so I think learning habits, good habits, like separating your work environment from your sleep environment, if possible, is huge for me. And being disciplined and setting a schedule has been really helpful. It's very easy to get into that mindset of like, I just woke up and I'm in the office. And so kind of dedicating some time in the morning before you start working to do whatever you need to do, make coffee, make breakfast, take care of some stuff, whatever works for you, do it. Just being disciplined to that schedule is really helpful. But I totally acknowledge it was not a seamless transition going from having not worked at all full-time to working full-time and then working full-time in a remote environment. There was a lot of learning and how this works. And I think also as a new grad, it's tempting to want to overwork because you are just coming out of college. You probably don't have a lot of professional experience yet. And kind of, I anyways felt like I had to prove myself. And I mean, I'm sure it depends company to company, but at a place like Basecamp, we don't want people overworking. We don't want people working more than 40 hours. And so I remember my boss at the time was like, why are you working at 6:30 still? Like, get off, go away. And that was hard for me because I felt like I still needed to prove myself. And I kind of thought like it would look good to work longer. And really that wasn't the case at all. And thankfully he kind of imparted that philosophy on me. And I think I've become a lot stricter with like only work 9 to 5 and like make sure you like sign off and like detach from work, which can still be hard. We're always connected, whether it's on the phone or the computer. And so a lot of it comes with time and practice of just being disciplined and knowing your boundaries and setting hard boundaries, I think.
I want to add too that we talk a lot about like tips and tricks for working remotely and combating the pitfalls. But at the end of the day, remote work isn't for everybody. We've hired a lot of people where it sounds awesome. You work from home, you don't have to commute, like you can wear pajamas all day. But when reality sets in, they realize that they really miss the being in an office. And that's fine. That's totally fine. We, you know, not everybody likes it. So if I would take some time to figure out, like, you know, once we're out of this pandemic and you have the option to go back to a physical office, like figuring out if that really is, like, if remote work really is for you, if you can handle it, if you enjoy it. If it's going to be a struggle every day, then don't do it.
Yeah. I just recently had a friend switch off of remote work after doing it for a few years, and he just kind of came to the realization, like, I need to be in an office around people. Like, you know yourself and know what works for you. And it definitely isn't for everyone, but you know, if you think you might be interested in it, I would definitely consider it at least.
Good advice.
Hi,
Again, I
I
wanted
have a,
to, oh, wait, go ahead.
hi, I'm Huey, and I have a question. So, I work for a market research firm, and we do offer people to work remote, depending on the cases. But for me personally, I find working remote, good, but for an extended amount of time, and like Justin, like you said, during this COVID-19 quarantine, it's quite isolating in a way that you cannot really go to a coffee shop. And so I saw on your website that within just the past week, there are over 5,000 companies signed up for the tool. So do you see, like, do those, out of those companies, like people who sign up, do you find any like patterns of like struggles or like challenges that they have signing up for this? And like, are there any like common challenges that these companies who like signing up for the tool face that you see?
Yeah, we have seen a spike in signups, which is indicative of the current climate. We don't kind of interview our customers that way or talk to them that way, but I think just the fact that there is a spike in signups for a remote project management tool is showing that companies are struggling with kind of having all of their information, having all of their communication, having a place for everyone to congregate like you do in a physical office. Basecamp is I don't want to come off like a commercial for Basecamp right now, but it's like a place where you store documents and you have face-to-face communications and you have chat and you have, you know, there's like pretty much anything you can do physically, have meetings, you can do within Basecamp, you know, with maybe some additional tools like Zoom. So the fact that so many companies are being forced to go remote right now and are signing up for Basecamp at the same time tells me that that having a bunch of tools that do the job that Basecamp does isn't working for them. Like they can't use Slack and Gmail and this and that, like all these different tools combined. Having everything combined in one place is giving them some peace of mind that the work is still getting done and people are still showing up, is my guess. Like I said, we don't really interview people.
Yeah, I think also trying to mirror how you work in an office with how a company works remote isn't necessarily one-to-one. And so I know one of the things we're big on is not having meetings all the time. And I think a lot of companies, as they're transitioning from their office settings to working remote, is they're still finding they want to have meetings all the time and go on Zoom chats. And I've heard from a few friends who say that since they've been working from home since the pandemic, they're finding themselves just on like constant video chats and not having the time to work. And so developing like a new work philosophy of kind of working asynchronously, I think can be really helpful. And the way Basecamp is set up is to encourage people to work asynchronously and focus more on like the written communication than on needing to like take an hour for everyone to hang out on a Zoom call to mimic what you would have in an office setting on like a stand-up meeting or something like that.
Yep, thank you.
Any other questions from students or any of our guests? And as always, you can ask throughout here in the little time we have left. But one thing that both Justin and Andrea said about, sometimes meetings for the sake of meetings, or companies that are new to remote work that are trying to carry some of their old communication practices into this new remote work culture. I read through your communication guide. I kept thinking manifesto was the word that kept popping in my head, but that doesn't always have super positive connotations. So we'll say communication guide tips on Basecamp site. And some themes that popped up were, how important time management is, as Justin mentioned, how important writing is, even sometimes over speaking, over live meetings, how writing is kind of set in stone. And it's something you can always kind of go back and reference. And just the idea of miscommunication kept popping up, and how that can really sink organizations or sink relationships in the workplace. Again, I know, having been with Basecamp for a while, maybe it's hard to compare it to other organizations, but I don't know if you can maybe talk about how some of those good communications practices that are in that guide have really helped you in your day-to-day.
It's a really good question. It's made me more intentional about how I communicate with people at work. Like you said, you just alluded to meetings. You can kind of just talk and you can have conversations, and then maybe a decision gets made or maybe not, or people are talking over one another. But when you're communicating in written form, asynchronously, with the expectation that communication is going to take some time and thought, it kind of adds weight to what you're saying, whether you like it or not. Like whether you want it to or not. If you post a comment on somebody's work, they know that you've taken the time and the care to craft that comment. So that changes your relationships at work. Like you have to be really careful about what you say and how you say it, not in a bad way, but just, if you want to move forward on work and move forward on a project, everything you write has to keep that in mind. It's not just kind of conversation for the sake of conversation, or a meeting for the sake of a meeting. It's saying like, okay, I'm going to be really intentional about what I'm contributing to this project. So that's like kind of become ingrained in me now, where I'm happy for it. I think it's a really healthy way to work, and you kind of strip away some of the excess stuff that happens at work sometimes. So I appreciate that aspect of the way that we work very much.
Justin, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I don't have anything to add to it.
That's fair. And just going through some of the other questions I think both of you had answered some of these throughout your conversation, but I do want
to add that we do have a manifesto, actually.
You do have a manifesto. Is it labeled manifesto?
Before we were Basecamp, we were called 37 Signals.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the 37 Signals manifesto, which is kind of like, it's a value statement, but they called it a manifesto. So it's out there.
Whatever works.
I'll put the link in the chat.
That would be great. Thank you.
Got it.
Yeah. I guess, if we don't have any other questions from students, I did want to kind of get towards closing out here with a question towards both of you. And I think, Justin, you kind of mentioned this in passing too, but like what's the biggest piece of advice you can give to a student or someone that's, starting their job search now? I know that's, maybe a big question with everything that's going on. Obviously nobody has all the answers, but what's one thing that you wish you had learned or you thought of when you were looking for your first job coming out of school?
It's a good question. I think my biggest piece of advice, and again, I guess it depends on what role you're looking for and what your background is, but I think for a lot of types of work, having a project portfolio and having real tangible work, whether it's school projects or personal projects outside of school, is very helpful to showcase yourself and present yourself to an employer. I think, like I said, also focusing on written communication especially with remote work and remote hiring, I think will be very important. Spending time on cover letters and writing a unique cover letter per job you're applying to. Don't just take a cover letter and slap a new company name into it and send it to every company you're applying for. Like delete it, rewrite it every time you apply. It sounds like a lot of work, and it is. I was at the DePaul library for months doing this, and it was very tiring and exhausting, but I think it pays off in the end because you aren't getting that personal connection with people face to face. And so you kind of have to supplement it with your first impression being like a cover letter where you're getting to like show yourself. And so focusing your time on that, the cover letter, project portfolios, and you know, polishing your resume. I know DePaul has great career advisors that are, you know, happy to help with that sort of stuff too. And so taking advantage of the resources DePaul gives you, I would strongly recommend as well. I wish I had taken more advantage of it. I did take advantage of it some, but you know, it's an invaluable resource that DePaul gives you. So take advantage of it for sure.
I'll reiterate what Justin just said. From an HR perspective, the last job we hired for, we got 1,300 and some applications in 2.5 weeks. So then we read every single one of them. We don't use screening software or anything like that. And the first thing we look at is the cover letter. I don't look at the resume first. I don't look at the code. First thing is the cover letter. And if it is speaking to this role that we're hiring for, to Basecamp, you know, and it's written, well written, engaging, friendly, like not professional is great, but like, is there a person writing this, or was this like auto-generated by some like a cover letter writing machine? Like, I want to see some humanity in the writing that I'm reading. It's less about like the technical proficiency of the writing, more about the person behind the writing. So that's what we look for when we're screening. Yeah. So that would be number one for me is to focus on writing, and just kind of tangential to that, applying to jobs intentionally. Like Justin said, he was looking for remote work. He was looking for jobs at specific companies when he graduated. It wasn't like, I want to be a programmer and then just applying to every programmer job that he sees. It's knowing the company you're applying to. It doesn't have to be like on a super in-depth, like in a super in-depth way, but just like being familiar with them and what they do and what you'd be doing if you worked there. In an interview situation should go both ways. I'm interviewing somebody to see if they would bring something awesome to Basecamp, and you should also be interviewing me to find out if you want to be a part of Basecamp. So having some confidence in that arena.
That's excellent advice to kind of close out on. And I'll throw out one final request if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask. Justin and Andrew, would it be okay? Could I provide your email addresses to students if they want to reach out to you afterwards with any questions?
For sure.
Totally.
Okay. Great, I will do that. Thank you. Everyone, I will be sending an email to everyone that attended with Justin and Andrea's emails, as well as a link to a really brief Qualtrics survey. It just basically lets us know, you know, what kinds of future events you want to see, and what else you'd like us to be doing, and if we're doing a good job, and how we can keep improving as a career center as well. Jameson, anything you'd like to add?
Oh, thanks a lot. We really appreciate you both spending some time with us today. So yeah. Thanks a lot.
One real brief plug to students for the Career Center. We are still doing advising appointments. They are all virtual, either by phone or Zoom. You can schedule a handshake as always. Again, it's just Justin and Andrea. I wanted to thank both of you again for being a part of this event today. I know the students really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. And you know, have a fantastic day. Take care of yourselves. Stay safe.
Thank you.
And same to all you students. All right.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Jameson. Bye, guys.
For having us.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.